Linking low-frequency fields and cancer. Dr. Wendell Winters of the University of Texas had been contracted by the New York Department of Health to investigate the effects of 60 Hz fields on cells of the immune system. In the course of this work, he had exposed human cancer cells in culture to the same fields, without specifically obtaining approval to do so. He reported that cancer cells increased their rate of growth by several 100% with only a 24-hour exposure, and that this growth rate was thereafter apparently permanent. The New York State Department of Health sent a team of investigators to Winter's laboratory. They reported that the work was not yet reproducible and was of questionable validity. The department also funded another investigator to repeat Winter's study. This investigator reported that he was unable to duplicate Winter's results. However, he had not done the experiment in the same fashion. Work was then carried on outside the confines of the New York State study by Winters and his colleague, Dr. Jerry Phillips of the Cancer Research and Treatment Center in San Antonio, Texas. Winters' initial observation was confirmed and extended, leading to several recent publications in reputable peer-reviewed scientific journals. At this time, the scientific evidence is absolutely conclusive. 60 Hz magnetic fields cause human cancer cells to permanently increase their rate of growth by as much as 1,600% and develop more malignant characteristics. These results indicate that power frequency fields are cancer promoters, that is, they promote the growth of human cancers. Winter and Phillips worked with human cells that were already cancerous, so they could not draw any conclusions as to the possibility that these fields could cause cancer. The promoting effect speeds up the clinical course of any established cancer and makes it that much more difficult to treat. Cancer promoters, however, have major implications for incidence of cancer because they increase the number of cases of cancer that become evident. We are constantly exposed to cancer-causing agents in our environment, ranging from carcinogenic chemicals to cosmic rays. As a result, we are always developing small cancers that are recognized by our immune system and destroyed. Any factor that increases the growth rate of these small cancers gives them an advantage over the immune system, and as a result of more people develop clinical cancers that require treatment. In 1988, Dr. Marjorie Spears of the Department of Preventive Medicine at the University of Texas Medical Branch, Galveston, reported a significant increase in the medicine of incidence of brain tumors in workers occupationally exposed to all types of electromagnetic fields. Specifically, she reported that workers exposed to 60 Hz fields in electric power utilities had an incidence of brain tumors 13 times greater than that in the comparable unexposed group. There are many other epidemiological studies indicating a relationship between occupational exposure to electromagnetic fields and cancers of many types. Most of these studies suffer from the shortcoming that the types of fields to which the workers were exposed varied from microwave to 60 Hz electric power frequency. It is therefore difficult to assign the risk to any particular frequency region. This has been used as an excuse to discount the importance of these studies. In my opinion, this is a specious excuse. The laboratory data clearly indicate a direct relationship between both ELF and microwave fields and cancer. Taken as a whole, the epidemiological data clearly indicate a direct clinical relationship. This view is supported by doctors H.D. Brown and S.K. Chattopadhyaya of the Department of Biochemistry at Rutgers University. After surveying the entire literature on the relationship between all electromagnetic fields and cancer, they concluded that animal carcinogenesis studies and human epidemiological data indicate that exposure to non-ionizing radiation can play a role in cancer causation, linking low-frequency fields and neurological behavior. Another researcher under contract to the New York State Power Lines Project, Dr. Kurt Salzinger of the Polytechnic University of Brooklyn, exposed rats to 60 Hz fields during fetal development and the first few days of life. The animals were then raised normally until they were 90 days old. At that time, they were trained in various learning routines along with a controlled group of rats that had not been exposed. Salzinger found that the exposed rats learned more slowly and made more mistakes. He emphasized that the differences were unmistakable and significant and that they occurred long after field exposure. Along the same lines, Dr. Frank Solzman of the State University of New York investigated the effects of 60 Hz exposure on biological cycles. He found that monkeys exposed to these fields showed a significant decrease in activity levels, judged by the rate at which the animals pressed a lever to obtain food. Surprising finding, however, was that this lower activity level persisted for months after exposure was stopped. Dr. Jonathan Walpaugh of the New York State Department of Health looked at brain functions under similar circumstances. He measured the levels of neurohormones in the spinal fluid of monkeys that had been exposed to these fields for 3 weeks. He found that levels of serotonin and dopamine were significantly depressed immediately following the exposure, and that only the dopamine returned to normal levels. Serotonin levels remained well below normal levels for several months. Both dopamine and serotonin are known to be associated with behavioral and psychological mechanisms. Recently, considerable attention has been directed to the relationship of depressed levels of serotonin to suicide. The data on this research were reviewed and discussed in The Lancet, 24 October 1987, with researchers concluding that a definitive relationship existed. This provides a mechanism for my finding, in conjunction with Dr. Perry, of a direct relationship between the power lines and suicide in England. The Battelle study, the utility companies respond. While the New York State power line study was going on, several other studies were also being done. Of these, the largest was a study conducted by Battelle Pacific Northwest Laboratories, a contract research laboratory in Richland, Washington. This study was funded by the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. In it, many pigs, genetically small pigs, were exposed to specifically constructed duplicates of 60 Hz power transmission lines for several generations, with a search done for developmental abnormalities or birth defects. The study was actually planned as a duplicate of the small study we had done in my lab on rats exposed to 60 Hz electric fields. Personnel from Battelle visited our laboratory specifically to see our apparatus and discuss our results before they began their own study. A few months after experimentation had begun, an epidemic occurred in Battelle's pig population. The researchers reported that they had lost almost all of the animals in the exposed group. Far fewer in the controlled group had succumbed. The researchers returned to square one and began the experiment again, but they failed to see the significance of what had occurred. As discussed earlier in regard to Dr. Guy's study on microwave exposure of germ-free animals, the chronic stress produced by field exposure makes animals and human beings much more susceptible to all types of diseases. The first batch of experimental mini pigs in Battelle's study were clearly stressed by their exposure to the 60-cycle fields, and so they died in greater numbers than did the unstressed controls. When the study finally came to a conclusion, the results were clouded with controversy. Battelle claimed that no evidence of harm from exposure had been obtained. However, many critics, including Dr. Richard Phillips, who was the original director of the Battelle study and who subsequently headed the EPA program on electromagnetic fields, charged that positive findings had been obtained, particularly in the area of developmental defects. Finally, it was revealed that there had, in fact, been an increased incidence of birth defects and fetal malformations in certain generations of exposed animals. The controversy that erupted resulted in Battelle's duplicating the mini pig study using rats. However, despite additional positive findings, the controversy was not resolved. Battelle still insisted that the studies were inconclusive and that further studies were needed. Recently, Phillips listed the positive findings he believed were obtained from the Battelle studies. These included the following: A marked reduction in the level of nighttime pineal gland melatonin in rats following exposure to 60 Hz fields for 3 weeks, a significant reduction in serum testosterone in male rats exposed for 3 months, changes in the neuromuscular system in animals exposed for 30 days, and an increased incidence of fetal malformations among both rats and mini pigs that had been exposed chronically over 2 generations. These conclusions are at variance with the conclusions of the official Battelle personnel. More developmental defects reports. While the New York State and Battelle studies were underway, Dr. Jose M.R. Delgado established a major laboratory for the study of behavioral effects of ELF at the Centro Ramon y Cajal in Madrid, Spain. Dr. Delgado is a world-class neurophysiologist, well known for his research on brain behavioral mechanisms and their control by electrical stimulation. This time, however, he was looking for birth or embryonic defects. Dr. Delgado exposed chick embryos to a magnetic ELF field of 3 different frequencies, 10, 100, and 1000 Hertz, and extremely low field strengths. Embryonic malformations were produced with all 3 frequencies, with most occurring with 100 Hertz fields. At this frequency, major developmental defects were produced by field strength as low as 1 milligauss. This report caused great consternation and a result in a flurry of reports from other workers, some supporting Delgado and others reporting no effects whatsoever. The research in Madrid was continued by Dr. Jocelyn Leal, who was able to consistently confirm the original findings. In 1986, the U.S. Navy entered the picture again. The Office of Naval Research supported an international study called Project Penthouse, which involved 6 separate laboratories. All would use identical equipment in an effort to duplicate Delgado's experiment. In June of 1988, the results of this study were reported at a meeting of the Electromagnetic Society. 5 of the 6 laboratories reported that apparently very low level, very low frequency pulsed magnetic fields contribute to increased abnormality incidences in early embryonic chicks. Despite uncertainty as to the mechanism involved, it is clear that ELF magnetic fields as small as 1 milligauss have the potential to produce developmental abnormalities in growing embryos. It appears that only 2 specific functional systems in the organism are primarily influenced by this type of field exposure. These are the brain and the growing tissues of the body, including fetal tissues and cancerous growths. The effects on the brain are mainly functional. For example, behavioral abnormalities, learning disabilities, alter biological cycles, and activation of stress response system. In growing tissues, field exposure promotes the growth of cancer cells and increases the incidence of developmental defects in newborns. Strangely, even though there is little cell growth in the brain, cancers of the brain are definitely related to ELF field exposure. There is one system that appears to be possibly related to many, if not most, of these effects, and that is the genetic apparatus. Because genetic alterations had already been shown with microwave exposure, it appeared possible that ELF field exposure might have a similar effect. The genetic effects of power frequency fields. A possible explanation for the production of genetic effects by microwaves is that the wavelengths of the microwave radiation may be small enough to have a resonant effect on the DNA molecule or the chromosomes. Orthodox scientists did not believe that this could possibly occur at ELF wavelengths, so they felt that power frequency fields from high voltage transmission lines simply could not produce genetic effects. Once again, however, biology has proved that these scientists were missing something. In 1983, Dr. S. Nordstrom and his colleagues at the University of Umeå, Sweden, reported that men who worked in high voltage electric switchyards fathered a significantly greater number of genetically malformed children than would be expected. The following year, Dr. I. Nordenström, a colleague of Nordstrom's, examined the chromosomal pattern of white cells, lymphocytes, and the peripheral blood of similar workers and found a significant increase in chromosomal abnormalities over normal. Exposure to the electric power frequency fields, 50 Hertz in Europe, produced abnormalities in chromosomes of the sperm of which switchyard workers, which resulted in birth defects in their children. The circumstance is identical to that reported by Dr. Manikawaska-Surska for laboratory rats exposed to microwave fields. Since 1983, Dr. Reba Goodman of Columbia University has been studying ELF chromosomal effects in both human and insect cells in culture. Her reports indicate a complex picture of many different effects. Some are quite overt, while others have been revealed only through new, sophisticated techniques. In Dr. Goodman's most recent report, presented at the 1988 meeting of the Bioelectromagnetic Society, she indicated that the effects appeared to be different for different frequencies, and that they also differed depending upon the type of cell exposed. More work needs to be done to sort out the effects and the responsible physical factors. However, there is no doubt that both microwave and ELF frequencies have the capability to influence genetic material during the process of cell division. There is even some indication that DC fields can influence mitosis and chromosomal patterns. This evidence is present in the latter chapter, along with the latest theory for physical link between ELF electromagnetic fields and the genetic apparatus. The spectrum between microwave and ELF. All of above reports dealing with electromagnetic fields are at opposite ends of the non-ionizing portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The power frequency fields oscillate at less than 100 times per second, while microwaves oscillate at hundreds of million times per second or more. Nevertheless, it is apparent that the types of biological effects associated with each are virtually identical. It is believed that this is the result of the modulation of the high-frequency microwave signal at lower frequencies. For example, Dr. W. Ross 80 of California's Loma Linda Medical Center has reported that the release of calcium ions from nerve cells following exposure to 16 Hz may also be produced by exposure of nerve cells to a microwave field modulated at 16 Hz. The microwave alone, unmodulated, has no such effect. The two types of modulation that are biologically important are pulsed and amplitude. Modulation is the secret of transmitting information by means of electromagnetic fields. AM radio, for example, is amplitude modulated. The radio receiver demodulates the signal, removing the carrier radio frequency wave and saving the slowly rising and falling modulation, which is what we then hear as music or voice. Transmission of the carrier wave alone would produce no sound or a steady tone, depending upon the type of AM radio used. It appears that the body also demodulates the signal when exposed to modulated radio frequency or microwave fields. The biological effect is that of the low frequency modulation. In this view, all biological effects are produced by ELF frequencies. This makes good sense because the systems that pick up the electromagnetic field are tuned to the natural frequencies between 0 and 30 Hz. These systems will sense abnormal fields that are close to the normal, between 35 and 500 Hz. The systems and then produce an abnormal effect. Microwave radar pulsed at 60 Hz would have the same bioeffect as a 60 Hz field alone, which explains the identical effects seen at ELF and microwave frequencies. It also indicates that all intervening frequencies, VLF, AM radio, FM radio, and TV, will have the same biological effects since they too are modulated. This intervening portion of the spectrum has received only spotty attention, and the number of reports dealing with specific frequency bands in the radio frequencies is small. Most attention has been directed to the most common sources of exposure, such as commercial AM and FM radio. Since the early 1970s, Dr. William Morton of the Oregon Health Sciences University was asked by the EPA to look into an excessive incidence of uterine adenocarcinoma among residents of a Portland neighborhood that contained an unusual concentration of broadcast towers. The project was expanded to study the relationship between EPA measurements of FM radio fields in Portland and the incidence of several types of cancer in the same area. While no relationship with adenocarcinoma was found, a small but significant relationship was found between field intensity in the FM band and the incidence of non-lymphatic leukemia. The EPA took no action on this report. In 1986, Drs. B.S. Anderson and H. Henderson of the Hawaii Department of Health surveyed the city of Honolulu according to census tract areas. They found that in 8 out of 9 census tracts containing broadcast towers, the incidence of cancers of all types was significantly higher than in adjacent census tracts that did not have broadcast towers. No action has been taken by the state of Hawaii Department of Health. The hazards are real. While the foregoing review of what has happened in this area since the 1950s may seem complicated, the reports listed are only a small fragment of what is available. In 1963, I was asked to write an article reviewing the scientific literature on the biological effects of magnetic fields. I was able to list a total of 44 published papers, the oldest from 1892 and the latest from 1962. In the years since then, so many more specific papers on the subject have been published that I have completely lost track. In 1974, the Office of Naval Research began collecting published scientific reports from around the world in the general area of biological effects of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation and publishing abstracts as a digest. This digest is still being published, and the volume of reports has now grown to a point at which there more than 1,000 scientific papers on this topic are published each year. The same time period also saw the establishment of 3 organized scientific societies concerned with this area of inquiry. See the resources section for this chapter. At present, 2 of the societies publish international journals, and additional journals are planned. Clearly, this is an expanding area of scientific interest and concern. The question with which we began this chapter appeared to have been answered. All abnormal man-made electromagnetic fields, regardless of their frequencies, produce the same biological effects. These effects, which deviate from normal functions, are actually or potentially harmful, are the following. Effects on growing cells, such as increases in the rate of cancer cell division, increases in the incidence of certain cancers, developmental abnormalities in embryos, alterations in neurochemicals resulting in behavioral abnormalities such as suicide, alterations in biological cycles, stress response in exposed animals that, if prolonged, lead to declines in immune system efficiency, alterations in learning ability. These bioeffects interrelate to influence the clinical state of a human being who is chronically exposed to any abnormal field. For example, the stress effect result in a number of stress-related diseases. If prolonged, this decreases the efficiency of the immune system, resulting in the increased incidence of infectious diseases and cancers. The concurrent effect of the promotion of cancer cell growth and the increase in the malignant characteristics of these cells lead to an increased incidence of cancers with faster than normal rates of growth. Note that all of these effects are cancer promoting, not cancer causing. However, the effect of abnormal fields run upon the genetic apparatus is becoming much more significant. Recent scientific data indicate that many cancers are the result of acquired genetic abnormalities that produce activation of oncogenes, which program cells to become cancerous. Because abnormal electromagnetic fields can produce genetic abnormalities during cell division, it is quite possible that chronic exposure to such fields is a competent cause for the origin of cancers. If this is correct, then the combined promoting and causing effects of field exposure could result in significant increase in cancers of tissues that are in constant cellular multiplication. This is compatible with the latest data indicating significant increases in the incidence of specific types of cancer since 1975. According to Dr. Samuel Epstein of the University of Chicago Medical Center, lymphoma, myeloma, and melanoma have increased by 100%, breast cancer by 31%, testicular cancer by 97%, cancer of the pancreas by 20%, cancer of the kidney by 142%, and colon cancer by 63%. All of these cancers are in tissues with continuous rates of cell division. We are frequently assured that we are winning the war against cancer, and we are told that the death rate from cancer is dropping. This argument is often quoted when the question of the relationship to the electromagnetic field is raised. Some scientists believe that since the total number of electromagnetic fields has increased markedly over the past 10 years, their overall rate of cancer should have increased at the same rate if relationship exists between these fields and cancer. This has not happened, so experts claim that there can be no such relationship. While the scientist's statement is true as it stands, what it really means is that the rate from some cancers is dropping due to earlier diagnosis and treatment, cancer of the cervix, or to changes in diet, cancer of the stomach, whereas the rates of those listed earlier are increasing. Two effects, decreases in some types of cancer and increases in others, do not quite cancel each other out. The overall incidence of cancer is slowly increasing year by year, and the relationship between field exposure and those types of cancer that are on the increase is evident. The effect of field exposure on human fetus is particularly important. The field of development from the original fertilized egg cell to the complex newborn is a result of a carefully timed and controlled series of events involving cell manipulation. Exposure to the electromagnetic fields will result in alterations of the rate of growth of these cells and will disturb the delicate balance of normal development. The work done in Madrid by Delgado and Leal on L frequencies was completely confirmed by the Navy's Project Penthouse and was complemented by the Battelle study on power frequency fields. Fetal development may be grossly disturbed by field exposure through the following means: a direct effect of the field upon the speed of and timing of fetal cell division, an effect upon the genetic apparatus of dividing fetal cells, and production of chromosomal abnormalities in the germ cells of the parents. The distinct possibility that genetic effects of a wide variety may occur with chronic field exposure is disturbing in view of the fact, generally speaking, such defects are permanent and are passed on to succeeding generations. The apparent inheritance of brain tumor tendency in the children of men who have been occupationally exposed to these fields may be a significant warning signal, somewhat more speculative, but still within the bounds of scientific imagery. It is the possibility that the genetic effect of field exposures may have produced alterations in pre-existing disease-producing microorganisms, making them more virulent or resulting in production of new diseases. That disturbing possibility is the subject of the next chapter. The interaction of abnormal electromagnetic fields with the brain is now evident, but it remains poorly understood at this time. Some interaction may take place through the pineal gland and the magnetic organ, and there may be different direct effects of the ELF fields on the nerve cells themselves. These effects are competent to produce behavioral disturbances and learning disabilities. The increase in these clinical conditions over the past decade raised the question of whether our increased use of these fields has played a casual role. The role of abnormal electromagnetic fields. Our ability to generate the entire spectrum of electromagnetic fields is a two-edged sword, with no understanding of the relationship of these fields to living organisms. We have produced a global environmental alteration that has profound implications for human health. Now that we have finally become aware of the serious consequences of this mistake, we have the responsibility to take actions to reduce this threat to future generations. At the same time, as we learn more about the subtleties of the relationship between electromagnetic energies and living organisms, we will acquire increased knowledge of how living things function. This knowledge will better enable us to use electromagnetic energy in our social and economic affairs and in our medical care systems. The new paradigm of life, energy, and medicine has the capacity to produce a better world for our children if we act wisely and quickly.